Have you ever walked past someone without giving them a second glance? Maybe they were standing on a busy street corner, selling fruit under the blazing sun, hoping someone would stop long enough to make a purchase. Maybe they looked invisible, like thousands of others struggling to survive another day. But what if I told you that one simple act of kindness from a woman who had almost nothing changed not only her own life but also the lives of countless people she had never met? This is the remarkable story of a poor orange seller named Emily Carter, a woman whose biggest worry each morning was whether she would earn enough money to pay for dinner. One rainy afternoon, when every dollar mattered and every orange represented another meal, she made a decision that most people would have considered impossible. She gave away the very last orange she had left to a hungry stranger sitting on the sidewalk. She believed she would never see him again. She had no idea that someone nearby had witnessed everything. What happened just days later would leave an entire community speechless and prove that the smallest acts of generosity often travel farther than we could ever imagine. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this remind us that kindness is never wasted, even when it feels like nobody is paying attention. Stay with us until the very end, because Emily's journey takes an unexpected turn that few people could have imagined, and the final outcome has inspired thousands who have heard her story. Emily Carter lived in a small American town where people hurried through their daily routines without paying much attention to the faces they passed. Every morning before sunrise, while most families were still asleep, Emily pushed an old wooden cart filled with fresh oranges nearly 3 miles to the downtown square. The cart had belonged to her father many years earlier, and although one of its wheels wobbled badly, replacing it was simply beyond her means. Every squeak of the wheel reminded her how fragile her life had become. She rented a tiny apartment with peeling paint and barely enough space for a small bed, a folding table, and a worn-out stove that only worked when it wanted to. Her husband had passed away several years earlier after a long illness that consumed every dollar they had managed to save. Medical bills forced Emily to sell nearly everything they owned. By the time the funeral was over, all she had left was her father's cart, a few crates of oranges she purchased on credit each week, and a determination that refused to disappear no matter how difficult life became. Customers liked Emily because she greeted everyone with a smile that never seemed forced. Even on the days when business was painfully slow, she found a way to ask people how their families were doing or wished children good luck before school. Many of the office workers knew her by name, but very few knew anything about the hardships she carried home every evening. They never saw her carefully counting loose coins on her kitchen table, wondering whether she could afford electricity that month. They never watched her skip dinner so she could save enough money to buy another crate of oranges the following morning. Pride kept Emily from asking for help. She believed that as long as she could work, she should keep going. Giving up was never part of her plan, even when life offered her every reason to stop trying. One particular week was worse than any she could remember. Heavy rain had kept customers indoors, leaving her with fruit that spoiled faster than she could sell it. The supplier who had trusted her for years finally warned that he could no longer extend credit if payments continued to fall behind. Her landlord had slipped a notice under her apartment door reminding her that rent was already overdue. Emily folded the paper neatly and placed it inside a drawer because looking at it too often only made her heart heavier. She kept telling herself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow more people would stop. Tomorrow business would improve. Tomorrow she would finally catch a break. But tomorrow kept arriving looking exactly like yesterday. Late one cold afternoon, as clouds gathered overhead and the sidewalks became quieter, Emily realized she had sold every orange except one. It wasn't the biggest or the brightest fruit in the basket, but selling it would give her just enough money to buy a loaf of bread and a carton of milk before heading home. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and waited patiently for one final customer. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. People walked by without slowing down. Some glanced toward her cart before continuing on their way. Others seemed too busy to notice her at all. Emily sighed softly and began preparing to pack up for the day. Just as she reached for the last orange, she noticed an elderly man sitting several yards away on the sidewalk. His clothes were worn thin from years of use, and his hands trembled from the cold. Unlike many people asking for spare change, he wasn't calling out to anyone. He simply stared quietly at the ground with the exhausted expression of someone who had stopped expecting kindness from strangers. Emily watched him for several moments before realizing his eyes had drifted toward the orange in her hand. It wasn't a greedy look. It wasn't even a hopeful one. It was the expression of someone whose hunger had become so familiar that he no longer had the energy to ask for help. Emily looked down at the fruit again. She thought about the bread she needed. She thought about her empty refrigerator and the rent notice waiting at home. She even imagined herself waking up hungry the next morning. For a brief moment, logic told her to keep walking. After all, she had worked all day for that final orange. Nobody would blame her for selling it or taking it home herself. Yet something inside her refused to let her ignore the man sitting alone on the cold sidewalk. She slowly walked toward him, held out the orange with both hands, and smiled warmly. "I think you need this more than I do." The elderly man looked up in complete surprise, almost as if he believed she had mistaken him for someone else. His eyes filled with emotion as he carefully accepted the orange. "Ma'am," he whispered, "this may be the first thing I've eaten since yesterday morning." Emily smiled gently, wished him well, and turned around before he could say anything else. She didn't wait for thanks. She didn't expect a reward. She simply pushed her empty cart toward home, unaware that someone across the street had witnessed the entire exchange without her noticing. As Emily disappeared around the corner, the stranger who had been watching quietly placed his phone back into his pocket. He had seen countless people ignore those in need, but what he had just witnessed was different. The woman who gave away her last orange clearly wasn't wealthy. Her clothes, her worn cart, and the careful way she counted every item before leaving told their own story. Yet despite having almost nothing herself, she chose compassion over comfort. He remained standing there for several minutes, watching the elderly man slowly peel the orange with trembling hands. There was something about the moment that stayed with him long after both of them had gone. At that point, Emily Carter believed she had simply ended another difficult day. She had no way of knowing that the quiet stranger across the street had just set into motion a series of events that would change her life forever. The man who had quietly witnessed Emily Carter's act of kindness was named Daniel Brooks. Unlike everyone else who had hurried past without noticing the exchange, Daniel remained standing across the street long after Emily disappeared from view. There was something about the moment he couldn't shake. It wasn't simply that she had shared an orange with someone who was hungry. It was the fact that she had obviously needed that orange herself. Years of experience had taught Daniel how to recognize hardship. The faded coat she wore, the unstable wooden cart, and the careful way she packed every empty crate before leaving told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't giving from abundance. She was giving from sacrifice. As he walked back to his car that evening, he kept asking himself the same question. In a world where so many people refused to help even when they had plenty, why would someone with almost nothing choose compassion over survival? Daniel was no ordinary passerby. Although he rarely spoke about his personal life in public, he had built one of the largest food distribution companies in the state over the previous 25 years. His company supplied grocery stores, restaurants, schools, and food banks across several cities. Success had brought him wealth, recognition, and opportunities most people only dreamed about. Yet despite everything he owned, he often wondered whether people had forgotten what genuine kindness looked like. Business meetings were filled with discussions about profit margins, expansion plans, and quarterly earnings, but very few conversations centered on character. Watching Emily give away her last orange reminded him of his own mother, who had once shared their final loaf of bread with a struggling family during a difficult winter. As a child, Daniel never understood why she would do such a thing when they barely had enough themselves. Years later, after building his business, he finally understood her lesson. Real generosity begins when giving actually costs something. That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Before going to bed, he instructed one of his assistants to find out who the orange seller was. He didn't ask because he wanted publicity or recognition. In fact, he specifically requested that nobody contact the local newspapers. He simply wanted to know whether the woman he had seen really lived the difficult life he imagined. By the following afternoon, his assistant returned with a folder containing everything they had managed to learn. Emily Carter was 53 years old, widowed, lived alone, rented a small apartment, and had been selling fruit downtown for almost 12 years. She had no children, no close relatives nearby, and no record of receiving financial assistance despite qualifying for several community programs. She had quietly struggled through every hardship without asking anyone to rescue her. Daniel slowly closed the folder and sat in silence. Sometimes the facts on paper tell only part of the story, but somehow these pages made Emily's kindness seem even greater. Meanwhile, Emily woke the next morning expecting another ordinary day. She had no idea anyone had been looking for her. Like always, she borrowed enough money from her supplier to purchase another crate of oranges, promising she would pay him back as soon as business improved. His patience was beginning to wear thin, but he agreed one last time. Emily thanked him sincerely and pushed her cart toward the square once again. Her shoulders ached from the weight, yet she refused to complain. She believed every new sunrise carried another opportunity, even if yesterday had ended in disappointment. As she arranged the oranges neatly across the cart, she whispered a quiet prayer that today would be different. Hours passed with little improvement. Some customers stopped to buy a few oranges, but sales remained painfully slow. Around lunchtime, she noticed a black SUV pull up across the street. Well-dressed men stepped out, looked around briefly, and spoke quietly among themselves. Emily paid little attention. Expensive vehicles rarely had anything to do with her. She continued greeting customers with the same warm smile she offered everyone else. One of the men eventually crossed the street and approached her cart. Instead of asking the price of the oranges, he smiled politely and asked, "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Emily Carter?" Emily hesitated for a moment before nodding. "My employer would like to meet you, if you have a few minutes." Her first reaction was concern. Had she accidentally violated some city regulation? Was someone complaining about where she parked her cart? Her mind raced through every possibility. She looked around nervously before quietly asking, "Did I do something wrong?" The man smiled reassuringly. "Not at all. Actually, it's quite the opposite." Emily glanced at her cart, then back toward the waiting SUV. Every instinct told her to remain cautious, yet there was something calm and respectful about the man's voice. After asking a nearby vendor to keep an eye on her oranges, she slowly followed him toward the vehicle, completely unaware that the conversation waiting for her would become the beginning of a life she had never imagined possible. Emily paused beside the black SUV, her hands still carrying the faint scent of fresh oranges. She looked down at her worn shoes before looking back at the man who had invited her over. It had been years since anyone had asked to meet with her for reasons that weren't related to overdue bills or unpaid rent. The rear passenger door opened slowly, and a man in his early 60s stepped out. His appearance was neat but understated. There were no expensive watches displayed for attention, no loud introduction, and no attempt to impress her. Instead, he extended his hand with a warm smile. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he said. "I believe you met someone yesterday, although you probably didn't realize another person was watching." Emily searched her memory, confused by the statement. She remembered dozens of people passing her cart throughout the day, but no conversation stood out. Daniel noticed the uncertainty on her face and continued gently. "You gave your last orange to an elderly gentleman sitting on the sidewalk. You walked away before he could even finish thanking you." Emily smiled softly. "He looked hungry," she replied. "It didn't seem right for me to keep it." Daniel remained silent for a moment. He had spent decades negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, speaking before investors, and leading hundreds of employees. Yet finding the right words at that moment proved surprisingly difficult. Finally, he said, most people believe generosity begins after success. Yesterday you reminded me that true generosity begins long before success arrives. Emily lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the attention. To her, the moment had never seemed extraordinary. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone remember it. I only did what I hoped someone would do for me if our situations were reversed, she answered quietly. Daniel nodded. Those words confirmed everything he had felt while watching from across the street. He invited Emily to sit inside the SUV, assuring her they would return to her cart within minutes. Although hesitant, she accepted. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Daniel asked about her life, not in the hurried way people often ask questions while waiting for their own turn to speak, but with genuine curiosity. Emily spoke honestly about losing her husband, the medical bills that erased their savings, the lonely evenings in her small apartment, and the endless routine of waking before dawn to push her cart across town. She admitted there were nights she wondered how much longer she could continue. Her hands had grown weaker over the years, and each season seemed harder than the last. Yet she never allowed herself to become bitter. Life has already taken enough from me, she said. I don't want it to take my kindness too. Daniel looked out the window for several seconds before responding. Do you know why I asked you to come with me today? Emily shook her head. Because yesterday you reminded me of someone I lost many years ago. He explained that his mother had raised him alone after his father died. They had lived in a tiny house where every dollar mattered. Despite their struggles, she never turned away anyone who needed help. As a child, Daniel often complained that they couldn't afford to be generous. His mother would smile and tell him, if kindness only comes when life is easy, then it isn't really kindness. Those words shaped the man he eventually became, but somewhere along the years of board meetings, business expansion, and financial success, he realized he had stopped looking for people who still lived by that principle. Until yesterday. When they returned to the downtown square, Emily expected the conversation to end there. Instead, Daniel stepped out of the SUV and walked around her small wooden cart, examining its cracked handles and unstable wheel. He looked at the faded paint, the patched-up shelves, and the tiny handwritten price signs taped to the front. How long have you been using this cart? He asked. Emily smiled. Long enough that it squeaks louder than I do. They both laughed. It was the first genuine laugh Emily had shared with anyone in months. Daniel then asked a question she never expected. If you could change one thing about your life today, what would it be? Emily thought carefully before answering. She didn't ask for a large house. She didn't ask for luxury or expensive vacations. Instead, she simply said, I'd like to stop worrying about whether tomorrow will be enough. That answer stayed with Daniel long after he drove away. It wasn't driven by greed or resentment. It came from someone who had learned to appreciate every small blessing while carrying burdens most people never saw. Over the next 2 days, Daniel quietly contacted several people he trusted. One owned a chain of neighborhood grocery stores. Another specialized in renovating small retail spaces. A third managed community development grants for local entrepreneurs. He asked each of them the same question. If someone had the character we all claim to admire, would you help them build something lasting? Every one of them agreed before even meeting Emily. Meanwhile, life continued as usual for Emily. She noticed nothing different except that a few unfamiliar customers had begun stopping by her cart. One bought a single orange and wished her a wonderful day. Another purchased an entire bag without asking the price. A young mother told Emily she had heard she was the kindest fruit seller in town, though she wouldn't explain where she had heard the story. Emily assumed people were simply being friendly. She never imagined that her quiet act of compassion had already begun spreading through the community in ways she couldn't yet see. Every evening she returned home believing she was still living the same ordinary life, unaware that people she had never met were already making plans that would completely rewrite her future. 3 mornings later, Emily arrived at her usual spot and stopped in disbelief. Standing where her old wooden cart normally rested was a brand new fruit stand, beautifully built with polished wood, sturdy wheels, a protective canopy, and neatly engraved lettering across the front that read, "Emily's Fresh Market." Beside the stand stood Daniel Brooks, smiling as several local residents gathered nearby. Emily covered her mouth with both hands, unable to speak. Tears filled her eyes before she had taken a single step forward. She looked from the new stand to Daniel, then back again, convinced she must be dreaming. For the first time in many years, hope no longer felt like something distant. It was standing directly in front of her, waiting for her to believe it was real. Emily stood frozen as tears streamed down her face. She reached out and gently placed her hand on the polished wooden counter of the new fruit stand, almost afraid it would disappear if she touched it. For years, she had imagined what it might feel like to own something that wasn't falling apart, something she didn't have to repair with nails, string, or borrowed tools. Yet standing there, surrounded by people she barely knew, she realized this moment was about much more than a beautiful fruit stand. Daniel stepped closer and smiled warmly. "This isn't charity, Emily," he said. "It's an investment in someone who has already shown us the kind of person she is." Emily looked at him, still struggling to find the right words. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You gave away your last orange when nobody was watching. You expected nothing in return. In business, I can teach people how to make money. What I can't teach is character. You already have that." The small crowd applauded quietly. Daniel continued. "Over the past few days, I've spoken to several friends. We've paid off your outstanding debt with your fruit supplier. Your rent has been covered for the next year. This fruit stand belongs to you. Every piece of equipment here is yours. And starting today, you'll receive fresh produce directly from one of my distribution centers at wholesale prices." Emily could no longer hold back her emotions. She covered her face as tears rolled down her cheeks. For years she had prayed for a miracle, but she had never expected it to arrive because of one orange. Word spread through town faster than anyone expected. Customers who had walked past Emily for years now lined up to buy fruit from her. Some came because they had heard the story. Others simply wanted to meet the woman whose kindness had inspired an entire community. Within weeks, Emily's sales tripled. Within months, they doubled again. Her tiny fruit stand became one of the most popular stops in the neighborhood. People often stayed longer than necessary, not because they needed fruit, but because they enjoyed talking with her. Children loved visiting because Emily always asked about school. Older customers appreciated that she remembered their names. Working families admired the fact that success had never changed her smile. One afternoon, a local television station asked to interview her. The reporter expected Emily to speak about luck. Instead, she said something that left everyone silent. "I wasn't trying to change my life that day. I was simply trying to make someone else's day a little easier. If kindness only happens when we can afford it, then many people will never experience it." The interview quickly spread online. Millions of people watched it. Letters arrived from every corner of the country. Some thanked Emily for restoring their faith in humanity. Others admitted they had become so busy chasing success that they had forgotten to notice people who were struggling right in front of them. Daniel watched all of this quietly. Whenever reporters tried to praise him, he always redirected the attention. "I didn't change Emily's life," he would say. "Emily changed mine. She reminded me why I started helping people in the first place." But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story happened several months later. On a chilly autumn morning, Emily noticed an elderly man approaching her stand. She recognized him immediately. It was the same hungry man who had received her last orange. He looked healthier now. His clothes were clean, and there was confidence in the way he walked. Emily smiled. "I'm so happy to see you again." The man smiled back. "I've wanted to thank you properly." He explained that the orange she had given him wasn't just food. It was hope. That simple act reminded him that there were still good people in the world. Instead of giving up, he accepted help at a local shelter, found temporary work, and slowly rebuilt his life. "I don't know if you remember what you said," he told Emily. "You said I needed that orange more than you did." He paused before continuing. "The truth is, what I really needed was someone to remind me that I still mattered." Emily reached across the counter and held his hand. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Sometimes gratitude doesn't need many words. Years later, Emily's Fresh Market was no longer just a fruit stand. It had grown into a neighborhood grocery store employing several people who had once struggled just as she had. Emily made one promise to herself. Every evening before closing, she placed a basket of fresh fruit near the entrance with a handwritten sign. It read, "If you're hungry and can't afford it, please take what you need. No questions asked." Most customers never took anything from the basket. But everyone noticed it. It reminded them that generosity had built the business they were standing inside. And every morning, Emily quietly added fresh fruit to the basket before opening her doors. She never considered it a loss. She considered it a thank you. Because she never forgot the day she gave away her last orange. If that single act of kindness had taught the world anything, it was this. The greatest opportunities often begin with the smallest decisions. You may never know who is watching. You may never know whose life you are changing. And you may never realize that the kindness you give today could return in ways far greater than you ever imagined. If Emily's story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what part stayed with you the most. Have you ever experienced an unexpected act of kindness that changed your life? We'd love to read your story. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might remind you once again that even the smallest act of compassion can leave a lasting mark on the world.